Welcome to Innovating Education, the podcast where we explore groundbreaking ideas and practices reshaping how we learn, teach, and lead. I'm your host, Dr. Riley Williams, and today we're thrilled to be joined by Dr. Richard Feenstra, an educational psychologist with an extraordinary global impact. Dr. Feenstra has taught over 200,000 students, traveled to more than 20 countries, and developed the APE model for decision making. But what makes this conversation extra fun for me is that we both have an extensive background in occupational safety and health. Dr. Feenstra, doesn't it feel like this field is where the real science of decision making is always being tested?
Well, definitely it is where naturalistic decision making is being tested, in that the decision making models, more rational models, we can call them traditional models, classical decision making, economic models, basically fail to work when it comes to real world scenarios, and specifically in environments such as occupational safety or professions like firefighting, law enforcement, military, pilots, or any number of other domains where we find ourselves making decisions that are high stakes under time pressure in dynamic environments.
Exactly. I feel like so many lessons from that world stick with you, especially when it comes to helping people make decisions under pressure. And that's what we're diving into today, the science behind better decision making and how it impacts education, organizations, and life in general. So let's dive in. I'd like to start with your journey. What inspired you to focus on the science and philosophy of decision making as an educational psychologist?
Well, the basic path for me was I was working as a police officer and became fascinated with the decisions that we were making and how we were trying to help, and trying to figure out why they were making the decisions that they were making. And so I began to sort of dive into doing some research, and it motivated me to go back to school and get a master's degree, and then eventually pursue my PhD. And I started off with what I think most people start off with, the idea of making decisions rationally, and that we need to use rational models. We need to be less emotional in our decision making. We need to go through this process to avoid cognitive bias, reduce decision errors. I came across naturalistic decision making. The models and research made so much more sense to me. I'd always struggled with rational models because when a decision is high stakes, under time pressure, a dynamic environment, you simply don't have the ability to use these rational models. They don't work. That's how my journey began. And, that's the path I went down, going from starting off looking into rational decision making, and then kind of finding the naturalistic decision making community.
With over 200,000 students from 186 countries enrolling in your courses, what challenges do learners commonly face when it comes to mastering decision making?
One of the biggest challenges is they keep trying to apply rational models to environments and contexts that rational models they deliver very poor results. And so a lot of times when they go through the courses and they start learning about naturalistic decision making and the various models and the way we apply things that we learn in the naturalistic decision making communities to real world situations, the students enjoy it because it resonates with how they make decisions in the real world.
You've worked with more than 20 countries. How do you tailor your workshops to resonate with such culturally diverse audiences?
Good question. I think it's one of those things I'm always fascinated by when I'm working with someone from another country another culture, we start discussing just differences in things such as even the definition of decision making. For instance, we speak English in both the United States and in the UK. So language is not the barrier, but in the UK, they say it's to take a decision. And in the United States, we say we are making a decision. And then if you go down to Spanish, in Spanish, it's also to take a decision. And in Germany, they often refer to it as finding a decision. And in Mandarin or in Chinese, they decision making translates to decision policy. So even though these are very subtle differences, it's a good way to kind of break the ice and start talking about what does it mean? What is the difference between taking and making a decision, and what influence does that have on the outcomes of the decisions the conclusions that we draw. There's also been discussions about what we focus on. And there's a couple books out there. One of them's called The Geography of Thought that I really enjoyed, that talks about individualist cultures versus collectivist cultures. We also discuss control beliefs. Depending on culture, you have differences in understanding who is responsible for a decision. Are you individually responsible, or is the group responsible for the outcomes? And how much agency do you have? And different cultures have different understandings of agency and volition. Those are things we dive into. And once we talk about those a little bit, then we'll move into things related to naturalistic decision-making, goal-oriented decision-making, and so on.
So I think that's a good thing that we can start with. Let's talk about your groundbreaking APE model: assess, plan, and execute. Can you explain how this framework stands out from the more traditional decision-making models?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a relatively new model. I developed it a couple of years ago at a conference with a colleague of mine, Brian Moon, and he had written a paper about the glaring gap in naturalistic decision making being motivation. And I started looking into it and realized traditional models ignored the role of goals in decision making. And while naturalistic decision making did not necessarily ignore goals, their focus was more on goals that emerge as a result of the situation, because it's high stakes, time pressure. So there was a gap in the research in decision making. But then I decided, well, let's go see what the research, those that research goals, goal setting, what they have to say. And I studied Peter Gollwitzer, Locke and Latham, preeminent goal theorists, and discovered that while they were definitely knowledgeable in how we might approach goals, they were using the rational decision models. So there was a gap there where the goal theorists, they are missing the naturalistic decision-making side of research, and the decision researchers are missing the element of motivation, goals, and self-regulation. So that's where the basis for goal-oriented decision-making came from, is to explore that gap, to make goals a focus, and to use that focus to then explore how we make decision-making in terms of the goals we're trying to achieve. And from that, develop the APE model, which put goals as a focus point. I have to give a ton of credit to Dr. Gary Klein, because he founded the naturalistic decision-making model, recognition prime decision model. And it's from the recognition prime decision model that APE draws from heavily. It adapts from the recognition prime decision model to create, and that's basically how APE came about.
Now, you describe APE as a system rather than a linear process. How do the components assess, plan, and execute interact dynamically?
Right. So this goes back to the differences between the rational model and a natural model, or a rational model and APE. So we've always been taught that in order to make a correct or optimal decision, you follow this rational approach. And so you go through a phased or linear process where you define the problem. And after you've thoroughly defined the problem, then you develop your potential options. And then after you've developed multiple options, you then compare and contrast and you evaluate each option against themselves in order to determine what the optimal or correct option is. At which point you then go to the next stage where you are selecting that option, implementing that option, and then finally you evaluate and see, has it solved the problem? But this is a very phased linear process. And the way to think about it is in terms of a computer with a single processor. Whereas what naturalistic decision making has found is that we're actually operating multiple processors at the same time. So at the same time that we're assessing, we're also developing plans and we're also executing. So it's not a linear process, it's multiple processors going on, all working together at the same time. And you can see this in so many different areas, such as if you're just driving a car, you're not going through and evaluating all of the options you have available and then choosing one and moving forward in some sort of sequential manner or concurrent manner, I should say. Instead, you're assessing while you're planning, while you're executing, and that process just continues.
What I learned to make decisions was the common pro-con list. How does that contrast with the APE model?
So the pro-con list falls under rational decision making. Develop your options and decide pros and cons of each. And that's simply not how we make decisions in the real world. I'm not saying that we don't ever use a pros and cons list, but that 95%, if not higher, are not decisions that rely on a pros and cons list. So for instance, the last time I can remember using a pros and cons list of any kind is probably a year ago. The idea that day to day that we are using some sort of calculator in our heads to weigh pros and cons is simply not accurate. Instead, a lot of times we're not worried about the optimal or correct decision. We're looking for a workable decision. It's a good enough decision that gets us to the next decision point.
At least for me, I am the type of person where I can envision a million different ways that my life could go. I could be a chef, I could be a marine biologist, I could do this, and I can see all the different futures. Of course, some aren't realistic, but how would that play into your APE model?
The APE model is about decision making in action, right? So it's less about the idea in goal research can fall under fantasy realization theory.
Yes.
Or you could look at the mindset theory of action phases. I like that model. I think it fits the question better. APE does use mental contrasting, which is kind of what you're describing. You're looking out and you're saying, okay, I can envision a future where I'm a chef, I'm an astronaut, I'm this, right? So when we assess, we are engaging in mental contrast. So, you are using a very natural ape approach. But when it comes to what you're kind of describing, it's more this idea of, and it also goes into another part of education, fixed versus growth mindset. But there's a lot of research out there that looks at how we shift from a more open to closed mindset during the decision making process. And so, uh, the what you're describing is you're in a place where you have the time, the resources, the luxury of, in some sense, to let your mind wander and to let yourself go, okay, I'm looking at, yes, at which point you then go through a process of trying to make maybe a pros and cons, or maybe you use a SWOT analysis to kind of filter out and decide which one do I really want to pursue. At which point you shift from this open mindset into a more closed mindset as you begin to take action. In the mindset theory of action phases, this is known as crossing the Rubicon. And it's a reference to when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, which was considered a point of no return. And he had to then shift his focus from this more open mindset to a more closed mindset. Now that I've chosen my path, how am I going to accomplish it? I don't know if that gives you any insight or explains that type of thought process. I know we all go through it, and you go through with fantasy realization theory. There's this idea that you're doing mental contrasting, and then you have to determine what goal to set and then act on them, because you cannot stay in that frame of mind constantly.
I want to come back to mental contrasting, but I have another topic that I'd really like to talk about. I consider myself a type B person in that I'm very flexible in different plans. And if one doesn't work, it's okay. I'll just move to the next one quite easily. My husband, on the other hand, he's a very type A, rigid person. How does that affect the APE model?
It would be the idea that when you are more flexible, and this is based on the particular domain you are in, it would shift you between intuition and deliberation, moving from an open to a closed mindset. I don't want to say more rapidly, but it would be a favored preference, let's say. So the willingness to explore new option really goes into this idea of seeking out novelty, looking to gain insights, as opposed to just going with what has worked previously, right? So, for instance, your husband, he's comfortable with a particular situation. He doesn't want to explore any new options. So he assesses, plans, and executes very quickly because he's comfortable with it. He knows it works. And he's not really looking to explore any novelty or potentially new consequences. Whereas you might be more open to that. So when it comes to making an assessment, maybe for a longer, again, I kind of don't like looking at it in terms of time, but you might maintain an open mindset and be willing to kind of deliberate and test things and then reevaluate based on those results. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, with mental contrasting, how does this technique establish what you call the situated motivation?
Right. Well, when you're mental contrasting, you're basically in engaging in mental simulation, determining where you are currently versus where you want to be. So you're establishing a gap. If it's a huge gap, it's very hard to be motivated if you don't see a way there. If you're evaluating the situation, but can't seem to figure out, okay, what action can I take that will actually get me to the end goal? Well, then you're fairly much stuck in mental contrasting, and you're not going to be able to take action because every decision that comes to your mind is not workable. And so, again, this is the difference between rational models and natural models, is this idea that instead of trying to evaluate a ton of different options concurrently, with natural models, with APE model, you are sequentially evaluating models. So you see the gap and you're like, okay, will this work? No. Okay, well, what's my next option? Will this work? No. But as soon as you find one that's going to work, then you say, okay, have an option. Let's see if I can explore that option further and make it work. So that's where mental contrasting comes in. You have a current state, and you have a imagined future state, and you're trying to simulate, what can I do in order to get to that future state?
What are the strategies that can help individuals manage unexpected factors during the assessment phase?
Well, the assessment phase it's not really a phase in the classical sense of rational models. You're assessing while you're planning, while you're executing. So the thing that really helps in managing and developing the skills necessary to make good decisions is experience. By gaining experience, we learn how to better manage when things go wrong. And this is probably one of the more difficult things for us to accept in general terms, that there's a certain appeal to rational models that says, okay, I can open up a book, I can learn a decision model, and then I can universally apply that model to every decision I need to make. Whereas the way we actually learn to make decisions and deal with anomalies, those things that violate our expectations, is through lived experience. The best thing we can do is expose ourselves in particular domains to a wide range of situations, gather those experiences, gather the pattern recognition, and that way, when something does jump out at us, we can recognize it. We can say, that shouldn't be there. And why do we know that that shouldn't be there? Well, because I have the experience to know that that's out of place. Where the rational models, that's just not going to happen.
Speaking of, creating a good enough plan can be daunting, especially in unfamiliar situations. What advice do you have for overcoming those challenges?
The best advice is, if you're struggling to create a good enough plan, is to taking a shorter time perspective and seeing what things you can accomplish, and to try to test a smaller aspect of the plan and see if that works. Instead of some grand plan, just take smaller steps and see if you can get anything to work. And then hopefully you will get feedback, and that will change the whole dynamic, and you can move forward and you can kind of get unstuck. It's kind of like, as an example, if you're trying to get to, you had a hike that you planned for the afternoon, and you in your mind, you mentally contrasted, you're going to get to the top of this hill, but you're taking a break, you're sitting on a rock, and you're looking at these different paths, and you're like, well, I need to come up with a plan. Which path do I need to take? At some point, if you're stuck and you're struggling to figure out what you should do, it's to pick a path, start going down the path, and get that feedback. and see if that small step might give you some new insight and allow you to then move forward. Maybe you go down one path and you realize, oh, well, this isn't going to work. Well, then at least you have found out new information. At least you're not still sitting there on a rock contemplating.
Is feedback internal, external, or both?
Well, it's both. It's both because you have to have experience that allows you to create internal feedback in the form of, a lot of times it's tacit knowledge as opposed to declarative knowledge, right? So tacit knowledge is very hard to communicate. Based on experience, you know that a fire should have a certain amount of heat that's coming off of it, or a certain amount of noise. Fires inside a house are very noisy, but you can't communicate that as a declarative knowledge and say, when you go in there, this is what you should hear. No, that's something that you gain from experience. And so you combine that external feedback with your internal repertoire. So it's both external and internal.
What's your advice for using feedback effectively to maintain or adjust motivation?
Right. So obviously, I think the two biggest levers in feedback is that you're receiving feedback in the right frequency, right? So you're not constantly being bombarded with feedback, so much so that you're not able to take action. And then the quality of the feedback. Is the feedback actually any good? And so a very simple example is, maybe you have a goal where you're trying to get healthy. So you're trying to lose weight. Stepping on the scale every hour, 24 hours a day, right? You're getting feedback too frequently. But if you're deciding that you're going to step on the scale once every 6 months, you're probably not getting feedback frequently enough. And then, of course, how accurate is the scale? Is the scale working? Is the scale actually giving you accurate feedback? And both of those can affect motivation.
So, balancing reflection and the action is very tricky in dynamic scenarios. How do you suggest individuals navigate this tension?
This goes back to the mindset theory of action phases, and this idea that we balance through becoming more open-minded and more closed-minded as we proceed towards our goal. And the balance certainly exists based on, again, we go back to experience and how comfortable you are with a given situation. And Adrian DeGroot, he did a lot of studies on chess, and he used chess masters to observe how they shifted from reflection into actually taking a move, going from a more open, reflective mindset, exploring different options, to the point where they would select a path and they would be able to very quickly move the pieces as they explored that avenue. And where we find ourselves almost naturally going back to periods of reflection is when something that we think is supposed to happen doesn't. And this is, again, it goes back to picking up on relevant cues that say, oh, okay, well, I assessed this way. I had this plan, tried to execute, but something's off. Something's not working. And that's when we end up going back into a more reflective mode. Whereas as long as things are going smoothly, we tend to stay in a more intuitive, just go, 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 because we're progressing at a reasonable pace.
So, how can organizations or educators incorporate the APE model into their professional development programs?
I think the best thing is being aware of the model and including that in your training, including that in your curriculum, because you'll see a lot of organizations, they will spend effort, resources on teaching rational models and critical thinking skills. But you will rarely find an organization that introduces goal-oriented or naturalistic decision-making into their workforce.
And that's exactly what I've been taught up until reading your research is the rational decision making. Like I said, going back to that easy pro con list, it definitely has made a difference learning about the assess, plan, and execute model.
If I was to give advice, these rational models, they're fine. It's good that you learn them. But the idea is if you want to be better at decision making, do so through lived experience and exposing yourself based on what you're trying to pursue. So say you want to be a better cook. You're not going to use rational decision models to determine what you're going to cook, how you're going to cook it. That's not going to get you that expertise. Instead, you're going to say, hey, let's open up a whole bunch of different recipe books in French, some Italian, and let's get in there and let's expose myself to a lot of different decisions. And through exposing myself to a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that, I will become a better decision maker through assessing, planning, executing, through the lived experience, through doing it.
How do you envision the APE model evolving to address emerging challenges in education and workforce development, such as AI?
Yeah, well, there's certainly benefits and limitations to AI. The way I see the APE model evolving over time is that one of the biggest things about natural models is we do not treat the model as a universal model, the same way a traditional model is treated. The traditional model says, hey, I can take this model and regardless of domain, I can apply this exact same model. Now, obviously with APE, you are saying that yes, in every domain, we're assessing, planning, and executing, but you're not using the same strategies as a rational model. The APE model will evolve over time in say the domain of firefighting, the APE model will be slightly different than the domain of law enforcement. And will be slightly different than in the domain of, say, education. How might a teacher benefit from the APE model versus law enforcement? The tools we use and this includes AI, how we use AI to assess a situation in education versus firefighting will be different. And it will be interesting to see how it evolves. And definitely, I do think that while APE is based on solid research that's been going on for 60, 70, 80 years, it's still a new model. And it definitely can be challenged. It can be improved. And I fully expect that to happen. I hope that happens.
Thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights. It's been a privilege to explore how the APE model is transforming decision-making today and education worldwide. Before we wrap up, for those who are inspired by today's discussion, how can they connect with you or learn more about your work?
Well, I have a YouTube channel, Decision Skills. I have a website, Decision Skills. And then on Udemy, which is where I have over 200, it's up to 230,000 students enrolled. I even offer a free class on the SMART method for goal setting. And so you can always connect with me through Udemy, Decision Skills, and LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find.
Thank you so much. To our listeners, if you want to dive deeper into Dr. Feenstra's work, please check out decisionskills.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Innovating Education for more conversations on reimagining how we teach and learn Until next time, stay curious and keep innovating.